All right, I'm going to explain forensic science and the law. So this is the first part of these notes. The second part is in a separate video. Make sure as you're watching, listening, that you're answering the questions or filling out the notes in the outline that you were given in class. Pause as needed to write things down, because make sure you're listening to everything as well as writing it down. All right, so, start with this. Here's a quote. In every school, every period ends with a bell, and every sentence ends with a period. Every crime ends with a sentence. So that's what their punishment is. So the start of forensic science, what is it? It's the study and application of science to matters of the law. It is using science to solve crime. So this includes being timely, meaning like this can't take forever to do this. It needs to be accurate. There needs to be thorough information so that all levels of the decision making are involved for our criminal justice system. So this involves the police, this involves lawyers, this involves detectives, investigators, and scientists in the evidence collection and analysis. So the word forensic actually comes from the Latin word forensis, which means forum, which was a public place in Roman times where they would all come together to discuss, debate, judicial proceedings. So kind of what should and would happen to people. So that's where the term comes from. All right, so two words that go with this are criminalistics and criminology. So they sound very similar, but they are different. Criminalistics is the scientific examination of physical evidence for legal purposes. These are people who work in criminalistics are scientists who are analyzing the evidence. These could be police officers collecting the evidence. This is for legal purposes. Criminology is the psychological angle. This is the why, the behavior, the traits. So this would be like if you've watched Criminal Minds, a lot of them are criminologists. So they're looking at the why, the motive, okay, the behavior of the people that are doing it. All right, so crime lab. So in a crime lab, which we have crime labs here in Minnesota, crime labs all have kind of basic things to start. So they're always going to have a physical science unit. So this unit is going to deal with physical evidence like drugs, soil, glass, paint, blood spatter. So this would be like areas of science related to chemistry or physics. That's where this would fit. Or geology as well. So the biology unit would be different. This is going to deal with like bodily fluids, like blood, urine, semen. DNA is a part of this. They're going to look at hair and fibers. And any sort of plant life related to this. There will be a firearms unit. This is ballistics. That's another term for it. This is going to look at any sort of tool marks or weapons, bullets, guns, are considered firearms. And then there will be a document examination unit. They're going to look at papers, documents, handwriting, ink, like computer things like that. And the last would be a photography unit. They're going to examine pictures taken and found at the crime scene. So these are all what every crime lab will have, the basic services, but then they might have more. So a bigger crime lab, like our big one in Minnesota is the BCA, versus some other ones that might be in kind of local, more police stations. These are going to have more. So like the BCA, they're going to have a toxicology unit where they're going to focus on chemicals in and on the body. They're going to have a latent fingerprint unit. They could, where their job is to just analyze fingerprints. Polygraph unit would be just analyzing lie detection. There might be a voice print analysis unit. That's any sort of recordings, voices, sound. And an evidence collection unit. Where they're going to specify in just collecting the evidence. We will talk about this more later because there are proper ways to do this. Okay, so forensic science and services. So like there's different areas or jobs related to forensic science. So forensic pathology or a pathologist. So if you just change the end, the ology end to ist, you're going from like the job to the person, like what the person does. Okay, so a forensic pathologist would investigate the death. So they're going to investigate the sudden, unnatural, unexplained, or violent deaths. Pathologists are going to be people that have a degree in medicine, so they actually go to medical school, but then their focus is on dead bodies. How did they die? All right, forensic anthropology, or a forensic anthropologist. So they're going to look at anthropology, which is kind of how humans have changed over time and evolution, but they're going to look at this in terms of death and crimes, and they're going to specialize in the skeletal system and kind of what bones and different pieces of the body can tell us. Forensic entomology. An entomologist is someone who studies insects or bugs. So they're looking at the study of insects and bugs related to crimes and death. We will talk about this later and how they can determine how long a body has been there or how long ago they died from the insects that are on it. Forensic psychiatry. So a psychiatrist, right, helps with your mental state, your mind. So they're going to do things with human behavior. They're going to do legal proceedings. So if someone says they are not guilty by reason of insanity, that's when a forensic psychiatrist would come in to determine if that's the case or not. So they determine competency and behavior patterns of criminals. Forensic odontology. So odontology is dentistry. This person would look at like dental records. Sometimes that's the only way you can identify a person, or bite marks. And a forensic engineer, they're going to look at like structure collapses and issues like that, like the 35W bridge collapse when that happened. They looked at kind of why the bridge collapsed, what happened, and they're going to do a lot of reconstruction, like replicating that situation to get it to happen again. The last one would be cyber technology. I mean, this one's huge, especially in the last, I would say, 15 years or so. The increase of everything online, in the cloud, all sorts of computer scientists, storage, transfer of information, and how we can get that. Think of like collecting text messages or phone calls and stuff. That's where cyber technology would come into play. All right, so places that have crime labs. A lot of states have like a big one like we do. Some local police departments that are bigger, like our St. Paul or Minneapolis Police Department, have their own. But these are big national ones. The FBI has their own crime lab. It is actually the largest in the world. So that stands for Federal Bureau of Investigation. The DEA has their own. The DEA is a separate entity. This stands for the Drug Enforcement Agency. They are just going to deal with drug crimes. They might work with the FBI, but they are separate. They have their own lab. The ATF has their own lab. They deal with crimes related to alcohol, beer, tobacco, and firearms. So they are the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The U.S. Postal Service has their own crime lab. There are quite a few crimes related to mail and fraud there, so they're going to have their own lab. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has their own lab related to anything nature, wildlife, and such. All right, so where does all this come from? Have we always had crime labs? What's kind of the history? The first crime lab in the world was in France in 1910, so just over 100 years ago. Edmund Locard was the first person who kind of started this. The first crime lab in the U.S. was in Los Angeles in 1923. And the first crime detection lab, so to determine if crimes were happening, was 1929 in Illinois. The FBI didn't open their crime lab till 1932 because it didn't exist much before that. That was around the time the FBI was started. So Edmund Locard is who we call like the father of criminalistics. He was a French professor, and he built that first crime lab or forensics lab in France in 1910. And it's all based off what we now call the Locard exchange principle. So the principle is this concept that whenever two objects come into contact with each other, traces of each are exchanged. Meaning, anytime two things touch, or if someone's in a room, something's left behind or something is taken with them. If I enter a room, it's possible that some of my hair could fall out of me, left behind, fibers from my clothes. I touch something, I'm leaving fingerprints. But also, things could leave with me. Maybe I'm getting fibers from the carpet on my shoes, or I'm outside walking somewhere, maybe I have dirt on my shoes. All right? Everything leaves a trace. Okay? So, if that's the principle we're going with, that means we need to be able to find what that is and trace it back to where it came from to solve the crimes. Okay, so he is the most important person in this historical kind of timeline of forensic science. There were quite a few others, so I will run through them quickly. Matthew Orfila, he worked a lot with forensic toxicology, so he was kind of the initiator in those chemicals and how to analyze them in and on bodies. Bertillon looked at skeletal remains and anthropometry. So he would look at like the size of a femur bone, for example, to figure out kind of what size person it was and kind of possibly what ethnicity and all things like that. Galton did a lot of work with classifying fingerprints, and we're going to do this later and talk about him some more in terms of fingerprints are mainly loops, whorls, or arches. So he categorized that. Lattice was the first to be able to type dried blood. So they couldn't figure out what type of blood it was till he came up with this method, unless it was wet. If it had already dried, there was no way for them to figure out what blood type it was. Osborne worked with getting documents accepted in the legal system as scientific evidence. And lastly, Macron helped advance the use of the microscope. For a long time, the microscope was king in terms of forensic science. Like that was the main tool used the most. Now we've advanced past that. We still use microscopes, but for a while that was everything. All right, so the forensic scientific method. Like you've all learned about the scientific method and heard it in classes. But first you have to say, what is the problem, or what are we trying to answer, okay? And we collect data to get our evidence, okay? We consider a hypothesis or a possible solution. So forensic scientists will say, this could possibly have caused this or made this happen, or it could have been caused by this type of situation. And then they're going to examine, test, and analyze it. So maybe there's blood spatter on a wall. How did it get there? The hypothesis could be the person was hit with a heavy object that was flat on the end. They might try to simulate that to see if they get the same blood spatter, the same pattern. And if they don't, they're going to try something else. They're going to come back to a new hypothesis and try again. So what does that evidence mean going forward? Do they have to circle back? And then if it does seem to fit this hypothesis they've come up, they're going to come up with a theory, which they always have to have evidence to support. They're never going to be able to go to court and say, here's what we think happened and here's who we think did it, but we're not really sure why. They need to be able to say, here's why, here's the evidence I found. I was able to replicate it with this hammer, which very much looks like a hammer that was in possession of the suspect. All right. All right, so the last piece is, how do we have to think to solve crimes? So we're going to use deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive is eliminating all the possibilities to get to the right answer. So what kind of is not eliminated? Inductive is figuring out which one you think is the answer and then finding evidence to support it. So kind of the opposite. We classify, we group, we put them into categories. We do this all the time with fingerprints. Okay, if we find a loop at a scene and then it happens to be a whorl on all the fingers of the suspect, right? We can't classify that in that same group. We're going to compare and contrast what things are similar, or how are they similar, how are they different. Problem solving, right? Trying to figure out how could this work. All right, we're going to look at different perspectives, like physically different viewpoints. And then also like different people's experiences and their personal perspective. And then we're going to construct and support. So we're going to have evidence to support all of these hypotheses and theories, and there's always going to be some error analysis. There's